So just a few words of introduction and welcome and a framing of this session. The welcome I'm extending is a welcome on behalf of the whole Iona community to this, the first of our series of Celtic Connection conversations. You can find out more about them on our website under the resources section, and we'll put a link into how you can find out more about those into the chat. This is a series of 5 conversations with a variety of people that we're putting on in order to explore the connection between our Celtic heritage and our current calling, our current passions, our current commitments. So we've had lots of lovely welcomes, lots of lovely hellos from people all around the globe. It is just wonderful to see so many people here. Thank you for making the time to come. Like I said, this is the first of a series of 5 conversations under the heading Celtic Connection. And I wanted just to say a word about why we're exploring that theme at this stage in the life of the Iona community. I'm not sure if anybody's here from the Wellspring community. Is anybody actually with us from the Wellspring community in Australia? Lisa Riley. Yes. Hello, Lisa, are you here?
Hi Ruth, I'm here, and Diane and Helen, and I'm just looking through all the other 100 and something people to see who else I can see.
It is absolutely wonderful to have you here, and I've been utterly privileged and thrilled to be invited to join with you in the Wellspring community in Australia on a creation care pilgrimage through the lands we now call Australia in the autumn of our seasons, so in September, October, later this year. And it was really inspired by the invitation from Lisa and Joy and Deanne and others that the theme emerged, because you asked me to travel with you through Australia as a Celtic Christian leader with Indigenous Christian leaders to explore the theme of creation care. And that immediately prompted a conversation, because being a Celtic Christian leader would not be the title I would normally give to myself. And it's not a title that we would typically use within the Iona community, but it's prompted lots of really interesting conversations. What do we mean by Celtic Christian heritage, and what would it mean to me to be a Celtic Christian leader? So that's why I thought, well, I actually am not exactly sure of what my answer to that question is. Let's bring the great and the good onto a screen and have a conversation. And as I said, we're utterly delighted that John is here with us. So I'm going to invite John to come up on the stage, and to do that, John, I'm just going to find you and bring you up on this into the front with me. John, it is an utter delight to have you here.
That's very kind of you. I think we've met before, Ruth.
I think we've met before,
yeah.
And you'll have met a number of these people on this screen before, I am sure.
It's true.
John, member of the Iona community, known across the globe for hymn writing, powerful leadership in the renewal of worship, now also leading, John, I'm sure you're aware of this, 2 fully booked weeks on Iona this summer on the theme of the future of the Celtic past. And when I saw that theme, John's weeks, I thought, well, let's ask John what that actually means to you and why you want to explore this theme. Because I think what you said in the blurb for that week is you'll be exploring, and I'm quoting here, the contribution of our Celtic traditions to ecology, spirituality, the community life, the gifted laity, and the identity of God. I look forward to hearing how those weeks go. John, with that background, I wanted to ask my first question. I've got 4 questions here. I think you and I have already had this conversation. Neither of us are actually Celtic scholars, at least not formally. We might have dabbled a bit here and there, and I did a little bit of a course at Aberdeen Uni a long time ago. And yet here we are, John, having a conversation about Celtic connections. And here you are leading these 2 weeks at Iona Abbey on the future of the Celtic past. So my first question is this. Could you share with us a bit about what interests you in Celtic spirituality or things Celtic, and what the relevance is in your experience to the world of our Celtic traditions for us today?
Well, that's a very big theme, and I'll never cover all of it. one of the things that fascinates me is that this tradition is not mainline. We're dominated in the churches today by Canterbury or Rome or Edinburgh or wherever the Methodists have their centre in different continents. And these are historic churches which at the moment seem in some places to have grown rather tired and are afraid of the acids of modernism or kind of retreat from engaging in issues of the day. And this tradition doesn't come with that baggage, because for a long, long time it's been totally forgotten and denied, in fact. So when you look at it, for me, when I began to explore it, it was something which was totally fresh, and some things stood out for me which nothing else had dealt with. I mean, the earth and the relationship to earth is one thing. We might, come to that later. But the way in which people had this great affection for Jesus, I believe that, and maybe somebody who's much more academically gifted than me might be able to endorse it. But one of the reasons why the ancient peoples, and we're talking from, the 6th century through to the, say, 10th or 11th, why these, first kind of Celtic Christians took to Christianity was because hitherto they had lived a life of total risk. Now, sometimes we, in the 20th century, think, well, nobody's really at risk now in the Western world. But if you went back to 5th and 6th century or 4 after that, all of life was a risk. 1 in 4 children would die at childbirth or just die after birth. You could be invaded by the Vikings when they certainly came as predators later on. You lived a life at the mercy of the elements, so that if the crops failed or if there was a disease among the cattle, that would affect your well-being. If you turned ill and herbs couldn't cure you, you would die. So life is totally a risk in these early days. And the people who were the people who had a faith, which some would say had a notion of a God who could be 3 persons, doesn't really matter. But the primitive faith that was there before was really about a God who was above and beyond all things, and who never showed his face and perhaps had kind of scant concern for the earth below, except that God had made the earth below. And then you have this new thing coming in, not with the Roman army and not with the panoply of the Roman church, but through wandering monks, first of all in Ireland and then come to Scotland, who say that this God, whom people have feared and whom people have recognized in thunder, and whom people have never seen, that this God has decided to become part of a fragile creation. I think the incarnation is God's risk, and the risk is taken not so that God can in person tell humanity how wrong it is, but so that God in the person of Christ can tell humanity how much God loves the earth and its people. I just find that mind-blowing. I remember once, ages ago, being asked by BBC television to talk about what for me was the most important verse in the Bible. And I said, well, I think it comes from the beginning of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was with God. And then it goes on to, Word became flesh and lived among us. I could not say that. I don't think I've ever really said this in public before. I broke down and cried. It's very embarrassing because there's a camera team and a producer there, and here's me quoting about the Bible and crying. And we tried 5 times and I could not get it. And it was later on when I reflected on it, I think it's because this is such an unbelievable thing. And that familiarity with these verses has to some extent dimmed my appreciation of the incredible risk that God takes of coming to earth. And it's that risk which comes in the name of love, which makes for me this tradition very important. Now, there's a whole lot of other things that come from that, but that's the essential thing. And for the Celts, John's Gospel was the favourite Gospel, and there's an old cross in the museum in Iona which bears witness to that. And this, you think of Ireland, it's a beautiful country which the Romans never invaded. I mean, we had them in Scotland, then we chased them back down to where you live in England. But they had an effect, you know, and their, well, and the law and the way with roads and the things that they built. Ireland was untouched by the Romans and never went there. And so it was possible for the Christian faith to be spread with few of the presumptions that happen when you have a territorial army in charge with the chaplains from the Roman Church as being part of their servants. And I think that's what enabled this tradition to see things that the more ecclesiastical, the more sophisticated philosophical traditions just didn't have. The value of ordinary human beings has been made in the image of God. The embrace of the earth for us and the way in which we should embrace the earth. And in some ways a freedom to think creatively about scripture. Because they never did any book. I mean, these people were, up until the 16th century, and certainly in Ireland, even past that, were totally illiterate. Sure. But had a total fascination with the Bible. And you see that not just in the writings of the monks, but you see it in the poems and prayers of the people. Now, for me, all of this was just such a refreshing difference from the tradition of which I'm a part, that I felt this must be looked at.
John, thank you. What a fantastic and wide-ranging response to, yes, a very big question. And I think what you've highlighted for me is the kind of happenstance of geography, that, you know, our landscape, our geography, the history of invasion and of walls going up and walls coming down has a huge part to play in the religious history of these islands, and that story can be transferred across the globe. And so remembering that happenstance and noticing it, and then asking ourselves, how much does that then need to inform and frame our outlook today, and how much can we shake it off and look with fresh eyes at a world so much in need of this kind of fresh approach. The other thing that really struck me was the tenderness, you know, your tears. Yeah, I get that, the emotion in those words, the direct speaking to the heart, but also the freshness, the tenderness, the fragility of the incarnation, somehow translated in the words of John's Gospel, but also, you know, wrapped up in that fragility of life, the riskiness of life, which so many folk still live. Not living these centuries ago, but still living a risky life. John, I want to turn my attention now to and to kind of continue that theme a little bit more, to go a little bit deeper, and ask you possibly a very personal question, and maybe you've touched on it a bit here. As a Kilmarnock lad, can you say a bit about how being Scottish with these Celtic roots, how that happenstance of your life has helped shape your own faith journey, your identity, your sense of belonging in the world?
Well, I suppose in the beginning, I knew nothing about it. Yeah. You know, one of the great detriments of the great Scottish education system is that they don't teach you your own history. Yeah. So, you know, now, around about the year 2000, and with the help of a member of the Iona community, we discovered that Scotland had a history with the slave trade. Never learned about that. You know, we learned about Italian unification, but we didn't know about the Highland clearances. And so it's only partly through working in Canada and USA that I began to kind of, you know, recognize that much of my presumption about the world was a totally Western mindset, and the education, as I'd perceived it, and particularly history, had completely obliterated the tragedy which happened within my own nation, and the tragedy which my own nation, Scotland, in league with the rest of the United Kingdom, had brought to other parts of the world. And that while, Kilmarnock, we had, in the 1970s, we had 6 major exporting industries, Johnny Walker's whiskey being one of them, exported, you know, sluice valves to Australia from Kilmarnock, railway engines going to Peru from Kilmarnock. And so the feeling was that we've just done such great things elsewhere. And then you begin to discover that actually that's not quite true. And then you discover that there is, before the Reformation, which was where time began for a whole lot of Presbyterians. No, nothing happened before. The Presbyterians were iconoclasts, so they, unlike in England, they destroy buildings, Iona Abbey being one of them, and there's no stained glass that gets knocked out, and they burn books of treasure from the Celtic period, and they knock down all the statues, and they have a pure church thereafter. And so neither in school nor in seminary did I know anything about the Celtic past. And so to some extent, my interest in it is by way of atonement, that I want to make up for what I had not known as an adolescent, as a teenager, not until I went to Iona when I would be around 30, and then began to discover. But that time, you'll barely remember this, Ruth, because you're so young, but in the 1970s and 80s, there was a kind of, word Celtic began to be used, but it was to do with rainbow doves and, Celtic candle making, a whole lot of other stuff. And it was really kind of frippery rather than the substantial thing, partly because in Scotland, unlike in Ireland, in Scotland, we didn't talk about it, and we had very few scholars who were beginning to open up the issue. So it's been a bit of a kind of pilgrimage, an intellectual pilgrimage and a spiritual pilgrimage for me.
And I can hear that that's one you're going to continue in these weeks on Iona. John, I've said this to you before, my first memories of you in 1970 something or 80 something was wearing a purple boiler suit with an alarm clock wrapped and tied around your waist. You were the archetypal Celtic leader for me when I was a young child, so you're never going to get away from that one. But what you say about this kind of, interesting what you say about, the Reformation, that's when history began for many of us Presbyterians. I wonder if that dynamic still operates in some parts of our country. Obviously it does. And we're speaking on today on the day that Humza Yousaf has been inaugurated as the first minister of Scotland. He's the first Muslim leader of a Western nation. Now, hearing him talk about his history and the story that his family brought from the Indian subcontinent in the 1960s, very fresh, very, I'm sure, startling for many people in our nation who maybe didn't know that story. So how many of our religious movements, our religious stories are very short term? Our memories are very short term. And I guess the invitation from this series is for all of us to look back into the myths that have formed us, the myths that have framed us, those stories that we were never told in school.
Yeah. I think also when we do that, we discover that this small expression of Christian witness is something which from the beginning had associations elsewhere, that Patrick, who kind of schooled some of the people who eventually schooled Columba, was himself schooled by somebody who knew the Desert Fathers in Egypt. I remember reading with astonishment that when an analysis was done of a particular blue dye in the Book of Kells, it was discovered that this could only have come from crushed lapis lazuli, turquoise color lapis lazuli. And then it was discovered that around this time when the Book of Kells was being put together in Iona, the only place in the world where you could get lapis lazuli from was Afghanistan. So right at the beginning, this tradition takes from the rest of the world. Yeah. There's examples of spirituality from Desert Fathers that takes dye from Afghanistan, and then when it moves out, it goes with barefoot monks almost into maybe as far as the gates of Kiev, and certainly down to the bottom of Italy, and elsewhere. So it's by nature, by its very being, it's an international expression of faith.
John, we've hinted at this weeks that you're going to run on Iona. Without giving the game away, do you want to say a bit more about what you're going to be exploring under the theme of the Celtic, or the future of the Celtic past? You made these wonderfully huge invitations that you're going to be looking at with it, for example. Give us a little hint of where you might be going with that, so that we can get a flavour of it.
Well, let me think of three. One is to do undoubtedly with nature, and to do with how the Celts regarded nature, and people may have heard this before, as one of the books which they read. You read the Bible, a small book, but only the monks originally could read the small book, but then the big book was the book of creation. And the Celtic tradition is not just about admiring creation, that's part of it, but it's also about entering into a relationship with creation, guided by the principles of the scripture. Western theology doesn't really touch creation. Augustine says, he's a great scholar, says very little about it. And I remember when I was in college, I had a kind of interest in liberation theology and was told it's a temporary aberration. But Leonardo Boff and people like that in Nicaragua, El Salvador, were realizing what was happening to creation and beginning to raise questions about it based on the Holy Scriptures, exactly the same way as the Celts did. They would know that there's a relationship between a lack of human concern or fairness to the earth and the earth failing to deliver its good produce to us. You have a line from Isaiah which goes, "The earth lurches like a drunkard, the sins of its inhabitants weigh heavily upon it." I mean, what a graphic description of how if we harm creation, if we fail to respect creation, then we'll pay for it. So that'd be one of the themes. Probably also talk about the way in which they use their imagination as an ally to faith. We have just finished doing a lecture on Saturday about how we looked at Jesus and how in the 20th and 21st century with these stereotypical images of Jesus. Well, these old Celts never had any pictures. I mean, there were very few, but they didn't have the panoply of Bible pictures from childhood that we have. Mm. And so you get, for example, this woman's poem about a woman who is going to throw a great feast. And it ends up when she says, I want a great lake of beer for the King of Kings. Now, that doesn't get into hymns, that notion that if Jesus was among you, you'd like a good lake of beer for the King of Kings. But that's part of their lovely ability to move outside the parameters of religious language and allow Christ to come close to them. And you find in some of the writings that indicate how people, particularly in the Western Highlands and Islands, lived when they didn't always have priests, that their life was a life which was rich in symbolism, that as they milked the cow, there was a prayer for that, that as they put the baby to the breast, there was a prayer for that, that they might light a candle during Advent, during Epiphany, after Christmas, in case Mary and Jesus and Joseph were coming by and they could come into their house and find respite. That when it came to baptizing the babies in Bara, if there was no priest, the person to do that would be the midwife. I mean, just a colossal thing. A woman will baptize a child if there is no priest. But then they knew that midwifery is one of God's professions. Yeah. That God calls Moses to be the midwife, to take the people through the waters, and that Moses is only in existence because two midwives called Shiphrah and Puah refused to kill him at birth, as the Pharaoh wanted done. So, I mean, I love the way in which they just mine the Bible. I mean, there's a couple of poems that sometimes I use where I remember doing this once with a crowd of Methodist superintendents. There were 200 of them, and quoted this poem in which it gives 2 or 3 allusions, that Jesus is the son of Mary, son of God on Mary's knee. I would get that. The mighty one from Bozrah on Mary's knee. Well, I had no idea where that was. And none of these 200 Methodist ministers, all biblical scholars, knew where that come from. But some illiterate peasant had heard this, maybe explained it to them. And then that was part of their internal furniture, the way that they think about God. Their faith was a treasure house which was stored inside them. It wasn't a treasure house of books in the library.
Sure. I mean, one of the things that I remember from when I did that year of Celtic Studies at Aberdeen was the lecturer Colin O'Boyle would come in and he would give us these remarkable lectures about Celtic history, but he would pepper his lectures with the phrase, but we just don't know, because so much of our knowledge is based on conjecture or on an oral tradition. So what would you say to those who say that, you know, this notion of Celtic spirituality, it's really all just romantic? Most of it is based in romantic 18th century Victoriana, you know, reconstruction. What would you say to that?
Well, I think that that would be true for the perceptions that people had from about 60s to the 80s, but there's much more digging being done, much more work being done, and a lot more manuscripts have come to light, which were never known before.
So
these things are not available.
Yeah.
Pelagius, a guy who had a big quarrel with Augustine, because while Augustine was going on about original sin, Pelagius was saying, well, I don't know that that's the whole story.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I never heard about him until relatively recently. And if I'd wanted to, I would not have been able to source him. Mm-hmm. But, you know, archaeologists and scholars of literature, and they deliver some things. And then, you know, people like, people collect stories from islanders. And when they do that, they actually trust the oral tradition. You know, we kind of think, we because we have short memories, we tend to kind of elaborate the truth or make it up if we forget, because we're used to doing everything on a computer or reading a book. But if you have no books, then your mind is much more focused on retaining that which you hear and replicating it absolutely in the way in which you heard it. In the same way as a child wants to hear the same bedtime story the same way, with the same emphasis and funny voices every night. Yeah. That is the kind of way in which people treasured what they had heard from those who went before them.
Thank you. I mean, I've got a last question, which is a kind of sideways look at this whole theme, John, and it's really back to where we started, which is why this series was initiated. So it's to do with the invitation that the communities had to come and visit with our friends in Australia. Mm-hmm. Later this year, there's going to be a crucial vote in Australia, which will, if passed, recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing what's called an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice in the Australian Parliament, a really significant vote coming up. There's a long and complex history shared between First Peoples around the globe and the peoples of these Celtic lands. What would your hope be for the reconciliation of relationships across the globe? That's a lovely, simple question. You've got about 3 minutes to answer.
Well,
give us a response.
I think that, and this is not disparaging the greater populations in Great Britain, but I think in Ireland and in Scotland, we perhaps have got a better chance of that because we're maybe a bit less imperialistic, certainly Southern Ireland. And in Scotland, we suffered under the Empire, you know, and a whole lot of things that have happened to Indigenous people in, say, First Nations in Canada, the Indians in America, and the Aboriginal people in Australia also happened to people here, that to some extent the Scotland and Ireland were the kind of first colonies where, among other things, land was desecrated and where people's culture and people's language was treated with less than dignity, and where the religious faith was questioned as being valid. So there is a common bond. There also is the fact that those of us who have ancestry in Scotland have to own up to how some of the awful things that happened, particularly in Canada, it happened with our forebears. I mean, I recently met a person from the Mi'kmaq tribe, which can cross the USA, North USA, and the east coast of Canada, a big tribe. And when in Harris, about maybe 15 years ago, there was a proposal to destroy a mountain and dig a super quarry, Chief Stone Eagle from the Mi'kmaq tribe in Canada came over to the inquiry into this proposal to give witness. And he began his statement by saying that people from Scotland and his people in Canada had met before, but not in the best of circumstances. Because among other things, what the Scots did was to take cloths which were infected with poison and gave them to the First Nations people, who became ill and died. It's an awful, awful thing. And this man came over here because he said he had seen what happens when you destroy a mountain in his home territory, and he could not face his grandchildren if he allowed that to happen anywhere else in the world. So he came here out of affection for the earth, in order that he might save a mountain from being destroyed. And the mountain was never taken down. The big company that wanted to fell it never got its way. So there is already a kind of commonality of experience. And whether it's in North America, whether it's in Australia, where I've worked with and engaged with Indigenous people, you find a whole lot of common aspirations and a common awareness of the beauty of the world, of the awesomeness of God, of the value of story as a means by conveying the truth. And I think that, rather than political treaties, might be the way in which we can enable a better harmonization of relations. But we have to admit our guilt, and to some extent have to be healed by those who we once affected, if not infected.
John, thank you. And on that note of healing and reconciliation, we're going to take a pause there. We'll come back all together in about 20 minutes. But for now, I'm going to ask Wendy to put some of the questions in the chat, and then we'll also put them in the chat when you go into your breakout rooms. And I want to thank you, John, for taking a punt on us and coming in and joining with this first conversation around Celtic connections. We'll come back to you once we've had some questions and some time in our wee groups. So there's the 3 questions. I think we're all back now. And so this next part of the gathering is going to be a conversation as if we were, there was maybe a microphone and 3 or 4 of us were sitting at one bit of the circle together having a conversation, and there's a kind of a swapping chair and people come forwards and then go back again into the circle with a question or a comment. So just to get us going, we've got one question from Deanne Speed that was put in there before you went into the wee groups about the significance of Bede's history of the English Church. Deanne, do you want to come to the front and have a conversation with John just about that? You have to just let me know yes or no.
Yes.
If you can.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. And it'd be good just to hear you articulate your question, and then we'll bring John in there too, and you can have a conversation.
Okay.
Go for it, Deanne.
Thank you. John, that was such a rich presentation. You just brought so many things together into a place where it all fell into place for me. Thank you so very much. It's just that when you were actually talking about the, I was fascinated. This is more like footnote stuff, I have to tell you, but fascinated that when you mentioned, the ongoing discovery of older manuscripts and the, the greater awareness becoming possible of the older Celtic history in the British Isles. And as far as I could see in my lifetime, the knowledge of real Celtic things always seemed to me to be traceable, not much further back than what amount of stuff Bede included in his history of the English Church and people. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's written from his more Roman point of view, but he was, a real scholar along with that. And there is information about stuff. And I have a memory without having it in front of me now that Pelagius featured a little bit somewhere in it as well. You mentioned him as well as the latest stuff about Aidan and the Synod of Whitby and that sort of thing. up in the north. And I just wondered whether in your knowledge of this, your much greater knowledge of this sort of new learning about the Celtic background, the British Isles, whether it's to what extent it's surpassed what people gathered from Bede. I mean, just if you could say a little bit more about where that knowledge is coming from. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't help you.
Oh,
I mean, you've given us the information of a person who was a chronicler, Bede, and there was no one in Scotland who was doing the equivalent, and nobody in Ireland. And so what people are doing now, I mean, there's one scholar who has managed to find out the books that were in the library of Iona when the monks were there prior to the Benedictines coming. But it's all fragmentary. You see, and these days people were doing the gospel, they were doing the evangelism, they were making the church. They were not chronicling it. No. And so you need to have somebody with a mind like Bede who thinks, for the good of the future, I should be writing down what's happened in the past as I know it. Yes. Now, there may well have been somebody who was his equivalent, but particularly in Scotland, we don't know the manuscripts which were burned. A friend of mine who's his PhD is in the psalm singing of the 16th and 17th century, and I asked him once, how much music, because we had a great composer called, whose name I forget, doesn't matter. We had a great composer who was the equivalent of Palestrina. Robert Carver was his name. Yeah. And he reckons that of the music which existed from the Celtic period onwards, probably 3/4 of it was burned. So, it's just fragments that are left. So that's as much as I can help you.
No, that's the scenario is very helpful and interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deanne. That's wonderful. And we're going to now, so if you do want to come into onto the screen to have your conversation with John, you can, or if you want just to put your question in chat, I'm very happy to put that question. And Helen Ross-O'Donnell has got a question which she would like just to go straight to John, which is this. John, what difference Helen's asking, does Celtic Christianity or Celtic spirituality make to my day-to-day faith now? What difference does Celtic spirituality make to day-to-day faith now? Over to you.
Yeah, I know, that's a very personal question. I don't know what Helen Ross-O'Donnell's faith is at the moment, so I can't tell what the difference is.
No, there we go.
But I think one can say that part of, to my mind, and I'm not speaking, I'm not giving instructions, but part of, I think, Christian maturity is to be open to that which doesn't come from your own tradition, and to see it not as an alternative or as something which is better, but as something which complements that which you might already know. Now, I say that because I was brought up as a Presbyterian in a community or a culture which suspected everything that was Catholic. Mm-hmm. And part of my maturing in faith or development has been in learning from Catholic cleaners in a place where I worked in London, Catholic priests who I know in Glasgow, and Catholic writers who I've read. And I think that the Celtic tradition, for me, is similarly a complement to what I already know. And it would be presumptuous of me to say that if you investigate it, you'll find A, B, and C, which will supplement the faith you have. You have to find that for yourself.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose I'm just going to join you up here, John, just so you're not quite so alone. But what I suppose what Helen's question raises for me is that we have the opportunity wherever we live in the globe to dig into our past and ask what relevance does our past have for our present and our future, and that might include some of the seeking forgiveness for wrongs of the past. But it might, for me, what's more focused, what's more compelling is the question, how do I mine my past, understand my history, my story, in order to give my current and future faith a sharpness and a relevance for today? So I do find it fascinating, the stories and the history. And yet I think I'm also always asking the question that Helen's asking about what's the difference that it makes to us today. There's a question from Gordon from Dundee. Gordon, can you just unmute yourself and tell me, do you want to come up here and join us, or would you rather I just read it out to John here? So it's a powerful question about Indigenous peoples.
I could come up and ask the question if that helps.
Let me just bring you up just so that you're, here you go. I'm going to add you. Go for it, Gordon.
Yeah, essentially when we were talking in the breakout rooms, we were talking about Indigenous peoples, and that could be peoples of Australia or America. That's the ones we were thinking about particularly, but it also made me think about the nature of farming. And when thinking about Genesis, how it talks about dominion. And I would reckon the book of Genesis was written after farming had become established, well established, because it was probably established 10,000 BC. So it was written from a perspective that there was a particularly settled culture of which human beings had dominion. We often think of Indigenous peoples being more in, as was said, more in connection with the land and with the earth. And I'm appreciating something of the Celtic tradition and appreciating it in the way that it's a theology that might help us be more Indigenous, if you like, in settled societies, because it has simplicity, it has sustainability in the sense that you belong to the earth and you belong to each other, that you share. You cannot really own anything. You can't, I mean, it's still absurd to me, how can we own land? And so, John, the Celtic way, is it a way of really taking us back to our roots, but without necessarily destroying much that is good, but just realizing it and appreciating it in a much more sustainable way?
Yeah, that's a good question, Gordon. I'm going to just in reply, I'm reading this book just now called God is Red, which is by an American Indian. He would self-define as an American Indian, a man called, what's his name? Vine Deloria Jr. This guy is schooled in Western theology, but he's also an Indigenous believer and respects the tribal religion. And he makes this very interesting comment. The question, and he's talking about the way in which Westerners look in the land, the question that emerges is whether the land is a thing to be used to generate income or a homeland on which people are supposed to live in a sacred manner. Now, I think that's in a way is one of the kernel things that this tradition talks about, that the land is not a thing. And you know, if you look in the Hebrew scriptures, you get this in the law of Moses, but you also get in the prophets, where God addresses the land as if the land were a person. When in the Noah's flood, the story after Noah's flood is that God made a covenant, and God makes a covenant not just with Noah or Noah's descendants. He makes a covenant with the whole land, and this rainbow is flung up in the sky so that the smallest daisy or mouse knows that God will never harm, by God's will, the earth again. When Jesus comes, you know, people love that verse, God so loved the world that he sent us. That's fine. But let's just stop at the world. God so loved not human beings, not the Christian church, not Catholics or Protestants, the world. And the word is cosmos. And that suggests that there's a divine affection, a companionship almost with the land, which we are encouraged to emulate and to see it not as a thing, but as that of which we are the inheritors and companions. Now, somebody asked me, what's the difference between dominion and domination? I said, well, look at Canada. It stopped being dominated when it was allowed to become a dominion to have its own integrity.
Thank you.
Thank you both, John and Gordon. We're going to move now to a question from Lorna, which is this. John's question to children. Lorna, I think you heard John say this, say your name, where you're from and what you're famous for. An unusual question which children and adults found hard to answer. I think, was that more a comment, Lorna, than a question for John? That's Lorna Kamak. but an interesting question indeed. There's a question here from Natalie from British Columbia or a comment really. Natalie, did you want to come onto the screen to share this with John?
Oh, okay, I can.
Let me just find you then. Here you come.
Yes, I was just making a comment about, how going from the sacred to a thing, and that was actually a doctrine that was created by the Roman Imperial Catholic Church and its empire, I think in the 3rd or 4th century, around the same time the doctrine of sin was created. So then it took the sacredness out of the earth, which meant then it was a thing and made of nothingness, so that then they could, extort and do whatever they'd like to the lands, because all of a sudden it was no longer a sacred anymore. And so these things were intentionally created in many ways, and it's affected a lot of us. I'm an Indigenous person from Ontario originally. I'm an Anishinaabe and Celtic woman. I live in British Columbia, but when we look at the history of what's happened with the Indigenous people in the lands, that doctrine allowed that, same as the doctrine of discovery. These doctrines that were created by the Roman Imperial Catholic Church allowed for a lot of the violations and colonization to take place across a lot of lands, whether it's Australia, Canada, the Caribbean, Ireland even. It allowed that, which is sad.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. I mean, what you say is absolutely true and highly regrettable. And I remember somebody talking about the Blessed Augustine, saying that what Augustine did, among other things, was to take the gaze of humanity away from the earth which God created and called good, and instead to focus it on original sin. And when your religion is based on the negative of humanity rather than the positive of God, then the door is open for every kind of legislation which berates people who are different and which diminishes the significance of the earth.
Yeah, very true.
Thank you, Natalie. Yeah, these are powerful questions. There's a comment from Jackie on the island of Lewis. Jackie, do you want to come and join us up on the front here? I'll just bring you up. And your question, I think, will be one that kind of will happily follow on from that one from Natalie. Here you come. Thank you, everyone, for your comments. Jackie, the floor is yours if you want to just unmute yourself.
Hi, yeah. Well, I'm in a very Celtic area. We were discussing this in our room, the Isle of Lewis. I'm just very close to the Callanish stones. But I'm from a very Presbyterian background. And what I've found is that, the Celtic is looked on as paganism. And it's, not looked down on, but it's suspicious of all the druidry and things that go on at certain times of the year. And yet, the people of Lewis, the crofters, Indigenous people, are more likely to be attuned to the land. So there's this weird dichotomy where we've got all these wonderful sites that people have built in the past to a god of some sort. And, is there any way that we could reclaim that? And reclaim's not the right word, but do you know what I mean? To use these sites as Christians, and would there be any way that could happen? We talked about open air services during our group, but it's just a strange place to be where you've got all this history, and yet the Christian population is very divorced from it.
Well, I was working earlier today, a lecture I'm giving, or it's a Bible study I'm taking in a couple of weeks' time, about how Paul in Ephesians talks about every family in heaven and earth taking its name from God. And it seems to me that one of the things which the Christian churches suffer from is believing that God is no bigger than the church. Now, I don't believe that God was waiting for Abraham to have a child when he was 100 and his wife was 90. I don't think God was waiting for Moses before all over the earth people would be aware of the magnificence of God and of the kindness of God, and to some extent of the truth of God. And I think that what we see as primitive religions shouldn't be used as something which is lesser or inferior, but rather they came from a dawning consciousness in people in different parts of the world that we were made for a purpose and that we were made in love and the world was given to us as a gift. And that we should be able to treasure that as part of the progression of the gradual revelation of God and see it as something which is important to us. I mean, the Stones Incarnation, the Ring of Brother and all the rest of it, these are important sites. These are places where people were making themselves known to a God who they couldn't fully understand. Mm. If we can have Christmas trees in our church, which have got nothing to do with the Bible, and a whole lot of other kind of paraphernalia at Christmas, which is totally unscriptural, we should be able, with a great more integrity and acceptance, to honour what happened before, not as something which was wrong, but was a searching after the truth for which we are very glad.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you, John. And I think, again, you're each displaying this kind of the rich seam of our traditions, which are right in front of us in the stones outside our homes in the land that we sit on. I'm going to bring Paul up now to ask a question about ritual and worship. So Paul, it's your opportunity now to come and just share your reflection here.
Thank you.
You need to start your video, Paul, I think, before I can bring you up.
It's there.
Oh. There we go. Paul,
thank you.
Go for it.
Well, in our little group, we were thinking about the ritual of communion. That was a pretty significant part of our chat. And it just occurred to me, thinking about reaching the unchurched people, to use a common phrase, is ritual a hindrance or a help? How does one compare ritual with the ordinary, living the ordinary, and having communion around your kitchen table with all the cups and saucers still there, as opposed to being in the refined conditions of a cathedral? People love ritual, but to reach those who don't really understand about this weird thing called religion and God and all the rest of it, what is the balance that one needs to get there?
Mm-hmm. Well, any field of human life has a restricted vocabulary. Whether you're an astrophysicist or whether you're a musician, there are certain things that would seem beyond understanding of folk who come else from a different kind of discipline or range of interests. And I think when it comes to ritual, I might not be answering your question, but I think that the churches have narrowed down ritual to baptism and communion, as if these are the only rituals. Mm-hmm. And the engagement with ritual is a form of symbolism in which you express a truth which is bigger than words can contain. And if people have never engaged in any kind of ritual action before, then communion must seem a totally alien sport to them. Now, if I take an example of a Baptist church which I worked in the south of England, where they wanted to have something which I'm really sorry has not happened in many places. They wanted a service of grieving. I mean, I think that would be such an important thing at the moment, particularly after lockdown, when people have lost folk and have been unable to celebrate their loss. But this was maybe about 15 years ago. But for some reason or other, they wanted a service of grieving. And coming from a Baptist tradition, which doesn't maximize in Eucharist or Holy Communion, they said, well, we have to have ritual action. So there were a number of things which they did over the evening people had a choice of different things they could participate in. And one of them was going into a corner and taking a piece of cloth and tearing it and allowing any despair they felt in them to be shown to God as they tore cloth. Now, that's a very ancient, ritual. People did it in the Bible, tore clothes. They tore them that much that God says, tear your hearts and not your garments. He's fed up a bits of material lying about. But on this particular evening, for the 20 minutes in which people could do anything they wanted of about 5 things in the church, the sound of this tearing was impacted. It just impacted you. You felt this is stuff which is too deep for words, and it's being put out there in front of God. Now, I think that the job of the church, among other jobs, should be to allow people to sense what in life is holy and that God is good, and through different kinds of religious experience, to gradually move into understanding that there's a centrality thing about Holy Communion. Doesn't need to be in a cathedral, doesn't need to have incense around it, but that it is perhaps our most sacred ritual. And you understand its significance better if you've already engaged in ritual action elsewhere and found its value.
Yeah. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Paul. I think we're going to probably just move to the very last question now, and then I'm going to ask John to say a few closing comments. And the last question, I'm just going to read it out. It's a question from Stuart, which is about how would we like to see the link between the Iona community and the Celtic tradition develop? John, I'm very happy for you to answer that question. I can say a word about that too, but yeah, what's Stuart's question? How we would like to see the link between the Iona community and our Celtic tradition develop? Because of course it's already there. How could it develop fruitfully for us all?
I don't have an immediate answer to that, because I tend to work cooperatively, and what I think might be quite good is not necessarily good for the whole community. I think it has to begin with us owning that we are not embarrassed about this. Yeah. If you'd asked me to speak on something like this 20 years ago, I'd have told you to go and chase yourself. Because at that time,
why do you think that was?
Well, it was because it was a bit of an embarrassment. I mean, I remember doing a lecture one night in Bangor. No, it was Portland, Maine, in America. And the next day, I'm about to go on a plane in the airport, and this woman comes running up to me like a banshee, runs up to me and says, Reverend Bell, I just want to let you know that I'm into Celtic things too. I said, oh, really? She says, yes, I'm into Celtic paper making. And I thought, I suppose if I asked you, your husband might be into Celtic deep sea diving. It was the term was being used for anything which was novel or new agey or slightly kind of off centre. And I think at that time, and that's 20 years ago, there was still an embarrassment about the word. But now that much more is known, and now there are, it's not just a matter of there being university courses on it, which there are, but now that people can read a lot more, and that authentic understanding rather than romantic understanding has become a possibility, then I think the first thing for us to do is to take it seriously. And perhaps to identify within it 2 or 3 strands which should be part of our witness.
And I suppose just to add to that, and back to where you brought us at the beginning about tenderness and vulnerability and risk, anything from our tradition which can increase our alertness to the vulnerability of the world, of the human beings, of earth in the world, of all created order, anything that can help us enhance our knowledge, our understanding, our empathy, and so transform the world to make the world a better place for all, must be a good thing. For us in these islands, and for those of us in diaspora around the globe, that might have something to do with this Celtic tradition. For others around the globe, it'll be a different route, a different story that forms and sharpens our faith today. John, thank you. Before we do a further thanks, just want to know if the floor is yours for the last couple of minutes, just to sum up where you think this notion of our Celtic connection might take us in the future more broadly, not just with the Iona community, but more broadly.
Well, I have no prepared speech. I think that this kind of gathering is very important, and that if through the next 4 evenings when people meet together, we can begin to see the range of possibilities within us, we'll discover a tradition which has got profound resonances, and which my own experience is keeps on turning up gems of insight, not least in enabling us to feel comfortable with the Bible in a new way. And I'll give an example. The Celts didn't have a Bible, so they just talked about it. And I think that's why a lot in their poems they make all these allusions to the Bible. They didn't have a Bible. They heard the gospel and then they talked about it. I was working in Preston, Roman Catholic retreat house, and we were looking at the miracle of Jesus turning water into wine. And I said to this group, a big group, I don't know, about 90 people there, I said, now, when Jesus says to Mary, I think the wine has run out, and when Mary says to Jesus, I think the wine has run out, and he says, my time has not yet come. I said, how do you think she says that? Was she whispering it? Is she saying, it should be very gentle, saying, oh, Jesus, I think the wine. How do you think she's speaking? So some people said, oh, I think she'd be very careful. Some people would say she wouldn't want to draw attraction to her talking to her son. Then this woman said, I think she'd be quite angry. I said to her, how do you think she'd be quite angry? She said, well, it's quite evident. She says, if you look at the story, Mary is at the top table. She's mentioned first. And she'll recognise why the wine has run out, because her son has come in with 12 disciples, and they probably haven't eaten or drunk for a fortnight. And that's where all the wine went. And I thought, this is the most beautiful thing. It doesn't say in the Bible how they spoke, but allow lay people to use their experience of life. And this was a woman who clearly had enjoyed food. Give people the possibility of allying their experience of life with the words of scripture, and you always get a surprise.
Beautiful. Thank you, John. And thank you to that dear friend of yours in Preston for that vivid image of how the Bible can come to life should we release it from the shackles of the pages. John, thank you very much. I'm going to just round up with a few words. I'll let you go and sit back in the body of the kirk, so to speak. I'll remove your spotlight for now. Thank you so much, John. But before we close, I want just to say a few words about where we go next. So the first thing to say is that if you go onto the Iona community website, and I think, Wendy, you're going to put a link in here about where to find this. There's a link to the Iona Community Learn, which is the banner under which this whole series is being hosted. And on that page, you'll find a book list. So some of the books published by through Wild Goose Publications will be relevant if you're interested in following up in your own reading. Then the next thing to say is that the next gathering is on the 27th of June, when we're looking at some of the theological underpinnings, and we'll have another group of the great and the good from around the wider Iona community and our partner communities joining us for that session. And so please do keep an eye on that page, which will be in the chat shortly, and will be a good prompt to you for you to register for each of these sessions. I want just to offer one call to action at the end of a session like this. What might I do next? So the call to action would be to say to you, if you're interested in finding a way to act out through this series, which is under the banner of Celtic Connection, particularly Care for the Earth, you might be interested in our common concern networks, which you'll find again on our resources page. And in particular, we've got a common concern network around the environment. We've got a common concern network around peace, a common concern network around faith and spirituality. Any one of these is open to any of you who are already members or associate members. And if this is your first time with the Iona community and you want to be part of these networks, you can just click the join button on our website. And by becoming an associate member, you're immediately invited to join any one of our 9 common concern networks, where you'll find like-minded folk curious about the questions that we've been raising tonight. So that's the one call to action if you're curious about that. If you're in the UK and you want to be active on the streets, the big one is a big gathering weekend of 21st of April down in London, where we're trying to get 100,000 people to wrap their arms around Westminster to say no to the climate catastrophe. So if you want a call to action that's going to take you onto the streets in London towards the end of April, find out more about that through our e-coracle, which comes out once a month. It's coming out this Friday, or you can find out about that through XR Peace on their website. So a final thanks to everybody that's been here, to all the people who asked questions, who raised fantastic comments in the chat. Thank you to Marvin and Wendy for helping with the technicalities. And a final thanks to John for your wise and reflective words on this, the first of our Celtic Connection sessions. Go in peace, everybody, and we will be with you next time we gather. Farewell.